That's impressive. I think that's quite impressive how everybody silenced at the same time. Liebe Nora Omorku, liebe Svitlana Matviyenko, lieber Nabil Ahmed, meine Damen und Herren, Mesdames et Messieurs, dear friends of Canada, mein Name ist Jean Ducharme, ich bin der Botschaftsrat für Kultur, Bildung und Jugend der Botschaft von Kanada in Berlin. Ich freue mich sehr, Sie heute alle zu transmediale Marshall McLuhan Lecture zu begrüßen. Welcome to this year's Marshall McLuhan Lecture, Nuclear Cyberwar, Speeds and Vectors of Energy Terrorism. Svitlana Matviyenko, you are originally from Ukraine, and you are now assistant professor at Simon Fraser University, British Columbia, Canada. Taking into account the current geopolitical context and Russia's aggression on Ukraine, we are honored with your presence here tonight. And I would add that it is with a sense of intellectual curiosity mixed with a certain feeling of urgency and fear that we will listen to you. Nabil Ahmed, founder and co-director of Interpret, you accepted to moderate this discussion. To both of you, a huge thank you for addressing this fascinating yet alarming topic. Dear Nora Omorku, künstlerische Leiterin der Transmediale, you could not have been better advised to choose a more relevant subject for this year's Transmediale. I would add that after the last two challenging editions, the last 2 years, we could not be at the same time happier tonight to see our long-standing collaboration resuming in person. We all like here the relationship we have with, that we have developed with Transmediale since 2007. And over the years with some other key cultural institutions in Germany. For instance, tonight, the Marshall McLuhan Lecture will give us the opportunity to take a step back and reflect on the medium at the core of Transmediale. Similarly, in less than 3 weeks, other roundtables here during the Berlinale will allow us to either reflect, in one instance, on the medium of short films and its use in context of therapy and social work, and in another instance, on the essential roles of women filmmakers in areas of conflicts. And also on the unique challenges that these women are facing. Concurrently, at the same time, the Marshall McLuhan Salon downstairs on the ground floor will be animated by a fascinating installation from February 16 to February 26 of the renowned Inuit artist Lakuluk Williamson Batory, exploring from a post-colonial perspective our relationship to the notion of territory. All these events are a true reflection of what we see as the relevance of cultural diplomacy. They address topics that may not appear to be at the core of diplomatic relations at first glance. Yet, these events create essential opportunities to explore elements of culture that help us better understand ourselves, one another, and better collaborate together. Bevor ich Nora Omorku das Podium überlasse, möchte ich den Teams der Transmediale und der Botschaft, die diesen Abend gemeinsam organisiert haben, meinen herzlichen Dank aussprechen. Un très grand merci à vous toutes et à vous tous. Je vous souhaite une agréable soirée et vous invite à revenir nous visiter dans le futur prochain. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming in such a great number. I wish you all a most pleasant and informative evening. Merci.
I wanted to say thank you all for joining us in the horrible rain. So I really appreciate all of the effort that everybody came to today. We're super happy to be back here at the Embassy of Canada for the first time since 2020 for this year's Marshall McLuhan Lecture. Since 2008, this lecture has been the focus of the cooperation between Transmediale and the Embassy of Canada. And each year we have selected a Canadian cultural figure whose work broadens McLuhan's ideas of media and technology. So I wanted to thank especially the Embassy of Canada for hosting us here tonight and for supporting this ongoing partnership. For this year's lecture, we've invited Svitlana Matviyenko, an assistant professor of critical media analysis in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University. Her research and work focuses on information and cyberwar, media and environment, and infrastructure and studies. Her lecture tonight is an important reminder of the many ways in which wars refuse to end, how military assemblages engulf and impact all aspects of our life, seeping into the everyday and eventually blending with what might some call a type of peace. As the war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine continues, her lecture is an important reminder of the many kinds of violence that spread from colonial acts of war, acts that scale us towards uncertain futures. So I really wanted to thank her for her huge amount of effort to be able to speak these words tonight, and for her long journey coming, especially for Kiev to Berlin. It's been a very strange few months back and forth over Signal. Joining her tonight is her respondent, Nabil Ahmed. He's the founder and co-director of Interpret, a research agency that pursues environmental justice through spatial and visual investigations. In his conversation tonight with Svitlana, he will draw out key aspects of her lectures that unpack the processes of dispossession that unfold through acts of war. At the end of this conversation, there will also be time for questions from the audience. So I wanted you all to join me in welcoming Svitlana and Nabil here tonight. Thank you so much.
Good evening. I want to begin by thanking all of you for coming here in this indeed very challenging weather. But especially I want to thank the team of Embassy of Canada and the wonderful team of Transmediale for giving me this place to speak, to tell more about something that I'm sure you concern, you worry, you're curious. War is unthinkable. Didn't I know that always? I did not. It is unthinkable when it is still approaching. It is unthinkable when it breaks into your world. In an attempt of grasping the unthinkable, a year ago, I began a self-ethnographic project documenting my struggles, parts of which were gradually published on the blog of the Institute of Network Cultures, and I thank Gert Loing and Michael Dieter for their support in this. Thinking further, I ended up with at least 4 concepts. Some are mine, some are borrowed from other writers, that I found helpful for thinking and being within this overdetermined, hyper-complex event and speculating about how it impacts our future. These concepts are martial assemblages, terror environments, nuclear cyberwar, and vertical occupation. The 4 parts of my talk are focused on each of them. Martial assemblages. There was a time, I still remember it, when it seemed to me we would escape the gravitational pull of the big war. But when last January media reported that President Biden had allegedly said in his fall call with Zelensky that the military incursion by Russia was imminent, the war started looking more real. There is no perfect analog to translate imminent in Ukrainian, so the word caused confusions. For example, the computer-assisted translation software gives it as nemenuche, which in English is closer to the word inevitable. Such translation was used by one Ukrainian major publication, then reproduced and disseminated by others. Suspended between pending and inevitable, a great war, no matter how proximate, still seemed avoidable until everything accelerated on February 11th, when the news of incoming intelligence went viral on media. A full-scale war would break on February 16th. Since then, every day was suspended between reality and fiction. Disseminated maps of bomb shelters, most of them inexistent. Formation of local groups of territorial defense without a clear agenda. People in military uniforms still without weapons populating the street. Me filling in online shopping carts with items for my emergency backpack without actually buying them. Resisting the idea of incoming war, I still wondered whether the Russian state, where the Russian state would stop before its militarist metastasis penetrates every inch of our everyday life, shaking and destroying all life-affirming relations and energies. I thought wasting them for nothing was already unforgivable and criminal. I thought it would be the worst that Ukrainians would have to live through in 2022, the irreversible militarization of life in proximity of something impending, looming, and threatening that would eventually dissolve, leaving militant practices and objects behind. One day before the announced invasion, I asked a friend if I could observe the training of local territorial defense groups for research purposes. One day after the announced invasion that didn't happen on February 16th, we were in the cab towards the fields and forest behind the town, where a man with a huge bag of weapons was waiting for us on the highway side. Having thrown the bag on his shoulder, he led us by a muddy trail away from the roads until we reached, in 10 minutes or so, something like a polygon where he carefully put the bag down, pulled a helmet, yellow glasses, anti-burst military headphones, and bulletproof vest, and swiftly wrapped my body in all that equipment. Perplexed by what was happening, I fully gave in under the weight of that stuff that started hurting my neck and shoulders, following the instructor lecturing on how every item in your backpack must be multi-purpose, how war demands self-care and augments the danger of little scratches, how war is primarily about debris, not only bullets and bombs and rockets. Within next 3 to 4 hours, I learned disassembling and assembling Kalashnikov 47 and the smaller gun along with the proper aiming techniques. Released from the vest and that heavy combat helmet several hours later, I kept back home with a sense that life had been already irreversibly pulled into a disastrous cybernetic vortex by forces one cannot resist. The war, I finally thought, was imminent. the martial assemblages had apparently formed way before I began documenting them. As political theorist Gervais Victor Grove reminds us, as a form of life, war proceeds by decomposing one kind of relations and assemblages that sustained peaceful life by another, martial relations and assemblages that sustain life during the war. I couldn't imagine that just within 30 days, all and more martial assemblages, the extensions of war, would proliferate epidemically and we would witness by reading, watching, hearing, seeing, feeling, and sensing through torture how the borderless empire broke into the sovereign territory by genocidal and ecocidal erasure, violently territorializing itself, driven by its imperial identity crisis in a delusional search for itself as a lost kingdom. Martial assemblages are not just soldiers, tanks, uniforms, gas masks, and bullets that, however, remain crucial to move war from the abstract to the concrete, as Grove writes. In spring and summer, with the war expanding deep in the territories far away from the front line, my flat began reminding a camping site on the 10th floor of an apartment building, with a wireless radio sitting on my desk, lots of canned food, 4 camping lamps, several headlights, bottles of Horilka, 2 camping stoves with 56 balloons of propane, 4 power banks, 10 of 5-liter water bottles, multiple boxes of candles, a pack of FFP1 masks against fine and solid dust and liquid particles, and of course, iodine pills. These objects entered my space gradually during the months of war in response to the new threats and developments of the enemy's military tactic to compose an intensive fabric of relations by which the war occupied my intimate surrounding and set its behavioral regimes far away from the front lines, proving the inexistence of a falsely presumed exteriority of war. And those who truly understand that give Ukraine the means of defense. The urban space outside my apartment building became densely populated with thousands of displaced civilians running away from the war. As the streets got blocked with Czech hedgehogs and concrete building blocks, designating the military checkpoints, when the enemy's move from Transnistria was still considered a possibility. Terror environments. By terror environments, I understand the realms of double targeting of Ukraine's population by weapons and by information simultaneously. Disinformation and propaganda generated by the Russian state-controlled media has gotten a lot of attention. The interest, however, was mostly towards the internal vector of the Russian disinformation and its impact on the citizens of the Russian Federation. The external vector of the Russian disinformation that reaches into the Ukrainian media sphere has not been given enough attention, but it is significant for formation of terror environments. Every rocket attack, every reported case of extreme torture, every documented case of genocide is followed not only by denial, but also by mockery on the Russian state TV and associated social media channels. This content is disseminated broadly, and the double-targeted Ukrainian subject of the war has almost no chance to avoid such harmful and traumatic encounter. When genocidal jokes and calls to drown Ukrainian children have become mundane, this is not the information war as we knew it. What we need to recognize here is a qualitative shift indicating the transition from the disinformation practices of deception as part of information and cyber warfare to the strategic production of terror. Let us think about terror. A premeditated and unlawful act of terrorism committed either by rebels or governments can be isolated, but it can also take part in the context of war. Clearly, war and terror are intimately related, historian Charles Townshend writes. Unlike fear that war always generates, the essence of terrorism is surely the negation of combat. The targets of terrorism are attacked in a way that inhibits or better prohibits self-defense. Russian forces, it seems, by now were better prepared for a parade than combat. Their attacks on critical infrastructure were meant to seize attention and paralyze the country by shock, horror, fear, and revulsion. In other words, they intended to achieve victory in a failed blitzkrieg by a series of distributed terrorist acts. The subject of terror is necropolitical. Here I draw from the work of Akil Membe, who draws from his, but disagrees with Foucault's assumption about a modern shift in exercising sovereignty, that, unlike the ancient sovereignty's right to kill, seized the control over the regimes of life, to suppress it by inciting, reinforcing, monitoring, and optimizing the forces under its control that Foucault calls biopolitics. Instead, Mbembe insists, sovereignty is still expressed predominantly as the right to kill. Through dividing people, as biopower does, into those who must live and who must die by employing a modern political mechanism of state of exception. A process by which the government dismisses the rule of law in the name of a specific cause or issue. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when the imperial state exercised its right to kill on the territory of another sovereign state, was justified by the Russian government as a necessary state of exception, also known as a special operation. Not war, and not even blitzkrieg, which was very much definition coming from the outside, that still implies a conduct in accordance with the laws of war, but warfare without clear definitions that uses in unconventional techniques and modes of employment. One of the most distinct examples of such necropolitical processes has been the filtration practices that precede forced deportation of the Ukrainian citizens from the temporarily occupied territories to the Russian Federation. With Daria Getmanova, we wrote about the filtration process with the explicit fascist undertones and the associated infrastructure of filtration facilities, often mentioned by media as filtration camps. Our research indicates that such practice conducted in the terror environments, genocidal by all conventions, particularly when it concerns deportation of children, produces necropolitical data subjects when the subject's data, communications, subscriptions, social networking, browsing, sharing, shopping, are cross-read during the filtration process against their biometrics obtained by invasive and humiliating body searches, aimed to determine whether to allow the deportation of the interrogated individual, or whether this individual might be more useful for other purposes. When they are found suspicious, the Ukrainian citizens are turned into a resource for abusive value, extracted from people under a threat or torture for producing more content to circulate on state-controlled Russian media and associated social media channels, where people are forced to make false confessions or apologize for assaulting Russian soldiers in their digital communications. Such abusive value, as philosopher Michel Serres argued, is a sign of ultimate suppression, and it always precedes both use value and exchange value in capitalist modernity. And we should add, especially in the political economic context when capitalist regime fuses with militant authoritarianism or totalitarianism, where any restraints or regulations installed by the international institutions over decades are lifted or ignored. Terror environments are composed with martial assemblages. The air raid sirens that became a typical soundscape since the end of February, generating a myriad of immediate affective relations between different life forms throughout the entire country, a profoundly cybernetic event of controlled communication in the animal of the machine. It is not surprising that the first blow on February 24th was inflicted by the enemy precisely on the radar units. The radar is good at detecting cruise missiles that flow at a low altitude and with a relatively low speed of under 1,000 kilometers per hour. And the Ukrainian defense system has about 15 minutes to intercept them. The reported interception rate in this case has been 70 to 75%. One of the most typical strategies of the Russian forces has been overwhelming Ukrainian air defense system by the number of rockets so that some of them managed to break through. Drones fly slow. When they are detected, the air alarm can last for hours unless the drones are shut down. The temporary martial assemblages transgress human regimes of attention and reaction when Russian forces use ballistic rockets, some of which can fly beyond the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds of up to 9,000 kilometers per hour, and the interception of which requires only a few seconds, making them much harder to shoot down. And then there is debris. There were many times when during this year, in my thoughts, I returned to my first unrequested military training lesson before the full-scale invasion. The flying debris, my instructor said, defines your immediate environment. Since then, when affectively linked with the thousands of other people in Ukraine by the wailing sound of the air raid alarm, I was often trying to imagine the potential speeds and trajectories of the pieces of glass, metal, and concrete that a shock wave may one day carry through my apartment in nanoseconds, leaving me no place or time to hide. Nuclear cyberwar. It's been acknowledged by the war analysts that, technologically speaking, the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war has accumulated tactics and strategies of both World War I and World War II. It is at the same time a trench and artillery war and an aircraft war, where computation is merged with anti-aircraft fire, when battlefield strategies are assisted by probabilistic calculations. This war is also cyber war, where with that kinetic use of jet bombers, helicopter gunships, artillery, rockets, batteries, tanks, small arms, and other conventional weapons, it involves electronic command, control, communication, and weapons targeting system, now amplified by Starlink technologies, signal and open source intelligence, and PSYOPs. In preparation for missile attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, Russian forces use aerial ground-based intelligence, and they monitor and analyze social networks with or without special software. So do Ukrainian forces to strike on enemy's positions in the Ukrainian east and south. This is where the cyber and kinetic means cross over and complement each other until it is difficult, if at all possible, to distinguish between them, to compose a hybrid cyber conventional war in which the two elements either fully coincide or phase in and out during complex asymmetrical military confrontations. In other words, cyber war of the 21st century is not about lower intensity, nor it is less kinetic, even when it involves high precision weapons or AI. Instead, it demonstrates how most recent technologies combine with the remains of munition from World War II, including rifles and rockets, trenches and dirt. And what we know from the Russian and Soviet history of warfighting is the reliance on unrestricted supply of cheap, disposable human resources, drawn from the colonized First Nations communities and many strategically underdeveloped ethnic and social groups. But there is another continuity between the wars of the 20th century and the wars of the 21st century. Clearly seen in this war, they all are environmentally conceived, ecologized wars. As Peter Sloterdijk brought to our attention 2 decades ago, the discovery of the environment took place in the trenches of the World War I. It was since the first use of gas warfare that the atmo-terrorist model was set to become prominent in warfighting for the next 109 years. The 20th century, he projects, will be remembered as the age whose essential thought consisted in targeting no longer the body, but the enemy's environment, the immediate atmospheric envelope. Since air and atmosphere are primary media of life, what is targeted is the air milieu in which enemy bodies move, subject to their own breathing reflex, he writes. Such atmo-terrorist model that uses war pollution as a weapon is topological in how it targets the subject's homeostatic body, or the body that is in constant communication with the environment from the inside, as the body has no other choice but breathing in the deadly air. The ethno-terrorist model at work during the Russia-Ukraine war has a nuclear dimension. In the first weeks of the full-scale invasion, we witnessed an unprecedented military occupation of nuclear power plants. First, within the first hours of invasion, when the Russian forces entered the territory of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which I also need to mention is not actually producing atomic energy, but is used as a state enterprise for decommissioning processes. Then, 1 month later, the occupation of the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, that became the center of an ongoing international nuclear safety crisis, more accurately described as an act of nuclear terrorism. Although 2 units, Unit 5 and 6, were shut down immediately after the invasion to reduce risk, Units 1 and 4 appeared in the center of a 2-hour combat, after which a fire broke out in a training facility outside the complex. It was later reported that a large caliber bullet pierced an outer wall of Unit 4, and an artillery shell hit the transformer at Unit 6. It was already clear back then that these instances of nuclear terrorism are threatening with the full realization of the grimmest scenario, turning the nuclear power infrastructure into a nuclear bomb. Soon after the Russian forces got control over the premises of the nuclear plant, they disconnected cable internet and some mobile services around the site, making monitoring impossible for the state in the state of information blackout. As a result, the International Atomic Energy Agency lost access to the real-time monitoring of radiation levels. Such information blackout, while the shelling of the nuclear plant's premises continues, creates a terror environment of that ethno-terrorist model, where the realms of cyber and nuclear intersect, and the boundaries of such terror environment expand far beyond the Ukrainian territory, opening the realms of the international blackmail. The action of Russian forces disregarded all points of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 that prohibited the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States, the countries that possess nuclear weapons, from threatening or using military force or economic coercion against Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, as a result of which, and based on the security assurances by its signatories, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons. We had never been so close to a nuclear catastrophe, now our scientists say, as we were in the mid-August 2022, due to the multiple attempts of disconnecting the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant from the Ukrainian power grid until after the visit from the International Atomic Energy Agency their delegation in early September, the last working reactor was finally put in a cold shutdown on September 11th, which requires less power for cooling, and the system could tolerate brief electricity outages. This case of nuclear terrorism during the Russia-Ukraine war is part of a complex asymmetric warfare. I propose to distinguish at least two vectors of aggressive blackmail that also reveal the overdetermined nature of this ongoing war. One vector is inter-imperial, and it concerns the aggressive processes of redistribution of power between several major players of international politics and economy. Another vector is colonial imperial, and it concerns the imperial relation of the Russian Federation towards Ukraine. Here, the inter-imperial communication unfolds according to the logic of deterrence, understood as a threat of force applied by one party to convince another party to restrain from initiating a particular course of action. While it is extremely aggressive, it is still a communicative exchange. Only the part that nuclear weapons play in such exchange has nothing to do with restraint, as it was previously assumed, but instead with acceleration. The circuits of such communication, understood broadly to include various political economic transactions, should not break. The system should survive for rebooting itself, even if it significantly transforms in the process. The colonial imperial vector is the trajectory of non-communication. It sets the direction for the relation of suppression, subsumption, annihilation, and erasure. All negotiations are suspended indefinitely. Ukraine does not exist, we are told. The colonial imperial vector sets the process to make this claim a reality, even if after the fact of annunciation. Vertical assemblages, or vertical occupation. A clear-cut victory belongs to the past. The concept of victory changed dramatically after the nature of international conflicts had transformed over time, context, culture, and especially with the advent of unconventional warfare. Although, admittedly, a clear-cut victory has always been a myth. And yet, we keep this dubious concept in our vocabulary because, as one American general authoritatively noted, in war, there is no substitute for victory. No matter how speculative, it functions as an operative means. The fight against the Russian invasion of Ukraine is also driven by the idea of victory. The shared assumption among Ukrainian citizens is that in this war, the military victory against the odds will be ours. The victory will be ours. Apart from some minor differences in opinion, this victory is almost univocally imagined according to this scenario. First, a full deoccupation and restoration of the Ukrainian territory's integrity, undermined at the very beginning of this war in 2014, the return of the annexed Crimean Peninsula and the removal of the Russian forces from Donetsk and Lugansk region, the tribunal and reparations to follow. As such, the idea of victory in this war is conjured in terms of territorial horizontality. The vertical occupation, however, is extremely long-lasting and no less terrifying and damaging. It is achieved by war pollution, acting as a weapon of war. In scholarship, pollution has been described as a form of slow violence. Writing about the gradual velocity of slow violence, environmental and political geographer Tom Davis describes the violence of environmental pollution also using the conceptual framework of necropolitics introduced by Mempem, indicating various ways how weapons are deployed for creating death worlds, in which vast populations are subject to living conditions that confer upon them the status of the living dead. In war, however, pollution spreads and violence occurs at various speeds. In addition to fast or extremely fast violence and rocket strikes, bombs, and various explosions that cause immediate harm and destruction and lead to the release of toxic chemicals, there are also these other slower forms of violence occurring gradually and out of sight, whether independently or as a consequences of these faster forms. Understandably, it is their slow and subtle nature that often renders them unnoticeable, elusive to human attention. Together, cases of fast and slow violence compose a chaotic reality of war, whose production of necropolitical death words or terror environments does not lend itself to easy comprehension. But we should be aware that occupation has even more dimensions than horizontality and verticality that we are still only are to discover. Taking such multidimensionality of occupation into account will let us realize that this war will not end with a victory, but with a sequence of heavy losses for the entire more than human community, all life and non-life forms. Accepting such scenario and working towards yet unknown modes of survival would mean transgressing the victorious fantasy inherited from the early imperial wars. It might be unbearable to know, but the late imperial wars, like the current one in Ukraine, do not leave us any safe exits from the catastrophic reality, and confronting it is the only option. Thank you.
Hi, how are you feeling? Thank you so much. That was really, I mean, I read the draft, which was really nice of you to share, but it was really wonderful to hear, you know, the final, or at least the version that you had prepared for today. And I do have some a short response that I prepared, but I just wanted to start by sort of thinking, thinking with you a little bit, right? That even though you had these 4 sections, it really felt that the martial assemblage section, right, which you know, which sort of begins so evocatively with your own, you know, presence and body and living through this war, is something that carries, you know, and is present throughout. Right, even in the moments where you're shifting to much more theoretical ground, you know, this is still there, of course, and it can be something that is a driving force. I wanted to actually just what I wanted to sort of share with you and also the rest of us that are here together is really to on sort of beginning to think around 2 grounds, right? I mean, 2 lines. One is how do we also make a link and connect to the maybe a third possible vector, right, which is around the climate emergency and where this war sort of sits within that. But also a second one that has been just going through my, you know, as I was hearing you, and I'm sure you all felt this, and as I read your paper last night, was, or on the flight, was also, you know, when just in these recent days when there has been, you know, I mean, I was watching the German TV yesterday, it was all over the news about these new tanks, these new armaments and so on, right? Big state stuff, you know, what can we do? You know, what as individuals and as the collective, right, around this term solidarity, and how can that be, you know, how is that reinvented, you know, in different contexts? But I will also begin a little bit with war, total war, which we could call the indiscriminate and simultaneous destruction of society and environment, right? It's not anything new. According to the historian Emmanuel Kirke, total war marked armed conflict beginning as early as the 16th century with the Spanish colonial conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires. Yet each total war may also be, in a sense, a new type of war, which you so clearly presented. But I think this also opens up new possibilities of resistance. And it would be really good to, after my short response, to hear from you. I mean, this was also questions that I had for you that I was sort of thinking and writing through. Resistance that is not necessarily of a martial kind, or not necessarily one that, you know, uses bullets and guns and weapons in response, right? But one that is nevertheless militant, and what is nevertheless not subjected to the demands of the occupation or the invasion. And you talked a little bit about this, which I thought was really imagine this, right? A moment where you're talking about donning on a vest and working with an AK-47. There's also this somehow this connection to care, you know, that you brought up. It was for me a humorous moment, if there were some in your lecture. But I think it has also opened up, this new type of total war has also opened up new possibilities of gathering evidence, as many organizations and people have been, sometimes by victims themselves, right? Across social media platforms and technologies that can help to clear the fog of war, which I think was really presented when you were speaking about the terror environments, right? And I was also thinking that the terror environments, as you presented, is not only a kind of disinformation as such, but also a call to incite violence, such as genocide. You know, the infamously, we know, for instance, the in the Rwandan genocide, the Hutu, their sort of state radio station, right, made this call, which said that all Tutsi were same as cockroaches. And this was a kind of call to incite violence among people, right? Which, you know, in this kind of cybernetic, you know, sort of information system, these were lethal speech acts, and in fact, subject to prosecution under international criminal law. This total war of aggression that was started by Russia against Ukraine, an imperial criminal war, and an inter-imperial war, as you explained, also affects and interrupts society and environment simultaneously. And as so, you evocatively argued, where society and environment are intricately interwoven, shaping one another and reshaping one another. Following Guattari, I also really felt that you helped us learn to think transversally again, across bodies, technologies, media, territory, and across scales, out of scale being the term that's sort of used as the title of transmediale. But in a way where it felt that it was, because you could combine your lecture with the ethnography or the autoethnography that you mentioned at the beginning, felt very different, right? From I mean, those of us that are not there, there's a lot of commentariat on the war with many positions, but I felt that it was a moment where, I could cut through the fog of war a little bit, at least, right? So thank you for that. But I would also add that from the point of view of the Global South, this war also shifted to a vastly expanded scale, in the sense that we are all also in this war, right? For example, as it raised the specter of famine and where food was used as a weapon by the Russian state, right? So rather than a world war or another world war, which so far have sort of centered, in Europe, in the sense of its political, sort of a center point. Following Etienne Balibar, we could also call this a globalized war, right? Where, these relations are no longer about, an imperial war or inter-imperial war that is happening in the north, right? And who better than people from the south to know and also share our histories of imperial and colonial wars. But yet in our conceptual vocabulary, right, war and environment and war and society are seen as separate things. To give a pressing example, in international criminal law, the impact of war on society is codified as war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. Arguably, the Russian state and individuals in the Russian state, from the head of state onwards, may be responsible for such crimes. But the impact of war on the environment, as intensive and extensive as it is, as you explained, for example, in your lecture on the vertical occupation right, only appears under war crimes, under a very specific limit, where the threshold of evidence that the prosecutor has to provide is extremely high. This did become a major concern in the 1970s during the height of the Cold War and the Vietnam War, when the US Army defoliated vast territories of Vietnam using Agent Orange and other defoliants, that led to the naming of a new category of crime, ecocide, which you also mentioned. But then global warming and global heating and environmental catastrophe was not on the cards. What was on the cards was nuclear holocaust or nuclear destruction. In more contemporary conceptualizations of ecocide as a fifth international crime yet to be codified, ecocide is often related to peacetime violations. And this is also something that I would be really curious to hear from you. And we gave this a name, to speak and to give a name to the mass violence from fossil capital, ecocide, as we understand it in contemporary contexts, right? And as you reminded us at the very beginning of the lecture, this word between imminent and sort of impending, right? The so-called peace is constructed, right, and underwritten by petrodollars and by militarization, across the imperial space. So I think we need to also strengthen our understanding and make more concrete how the war in Ukraine is intimately tied up with energy geopolitics, right? And link those lines of evidence. And I was thinking about this term, energy terrorism, right? And how that term can be also opened up in other ways, right? Which, you know, if we think about the way oil moves, rather than, let's say, coal, which is this object, oil is all about the flow, right? And it sort of connects and it's become such capital's favorite sort of object. In fact, when you spoke about your makeshift campsite, and I didn't know what it looked like until I saw the photo. It sort of totally connects to this next little section that I was writing, which is about the words of Svitlana Karovska. She is one of Ukraine's leading climate scientists and represented, along with a team of 11, Ukraine in the last COP conference, right, where, as I read in The Guardian, the Ukraine's sort of a presentation, you know, wasn't about the green transition and you know, these sort of, well, as in happy colors and getting people to come on board the transition, but it was rather an exhibition of the debris of the war, right, and their sort of environmental sort of focus. Karovska compared Russia's attack on Ukraine to the destruction inflicted upon countries in the global south by hurricanes, floods, and other climate impacts caused by global heating, where for black and brown bodies, climate change is also an existential threat. This is, again, not, in my mind, metaphorical, right? As she wrote, forests have been torn up by bombs, farmlands have been laced with mines. While these forms of destruction are different from cyclones, for Krakowska, fossil fuels caused climate change and it caused this war. Here, I thought a recent article, and one of the, I assume the last articles written by Bruno Latour is instructive and useful. Where Latour suggested that there are in fact two wars taking place that are happening across two fronts, right? Well, there's also, of course, many other wars going on in the world today and have continued to continue. But Russia's criminal war against Ukraine, but also war against nature in its broadest sense, not as an abstraction, but as very real, that are taking place in the front lines of Bangladesh and Pacific Island nations, and in the fight against extractivism by indigenous peoples from Amazonia to the Arctic. This second war is not metaphorical. This second war's prosecutors were mainly white Europeans, and today it recognizes borders politically between the habitable and the increasingly inhabitable spaces, such as EU's borders against migrants from the south. Yet, as Svitlana so clearly pointed out, Russia's position since the beginning of the war was not to call the attack a war at all, but rather a police operation. Some would say the second war is also not a war at all. As noted by Naomi Klein in a recent piece for The Intercept, actually the convergence of these two wars took place in one juncture, where weaning off of Russian oil and gas by the West was also framed in the context of the green transition. And I'd also like to hear from you, right, this moment, right, which you speak about, you know, fighting and survival and the defense and that focus, right, where, you know, where not everything can happen at once. First, the point and the effort is to kick Russia out, and then maybe can come more these ideas that can sort of take shape within what would be a new configuration of the Ukrainian state. But to this war, following what you said at the end, I would also add that both wars' victims are not only the civilians, right, but also the non-human forces and non-humans. And this idea is inscribed, this idea of nature having its own standing in an ecocentric legal concept, such as ecocide or rights of nature. Yet as spring approaches in a new phase of the war, there are no easy answers. Norway, the country where I live, is expanding its extractive operations and opening up new areas for oil, gas, and minerals in this fight. So a question to you, right, is what are the new lines of solidarities, that are possible? I was also thinking about what happened in my country, Bangladesh, where I'm from. Victory became like a horizon concept, right, for many anti-colonial, anti-imperial struggles in the 20th century. But it was possible, and we did it, right? Of course, new kinds of colonialism came to neoliberalism, came into that fold, but something happened. There was a shift. And the military, leftists, Bengali nationalists, peasant social movements all banded together with one purpose: to remove West Pakistan's army from our soil. So in that sense, I think there's a room, right, for solidarity, thinking along transversely as you did. And again, a huge thanks for helping us all to think together on this precipitous moment in our time, sitting here in Berlin, in the Canadian embassy. Thank you again. And I know there's lots of questions sort of nested in here, but maybe, just to start very briefly with you being here, and how does Marshall Assemblage move to care and solidarity? Thank you.
Do I need it? Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Nabil, so much for such a profound response. And of course, there are so many questions that I can really only start thinking. And one of the most difficult things is actually, especially being there, is also to find the time and space for thinking. It's a very particular event, right? And even preparing this lecture, it was very hard to do there. So I basically did the most work when I arrived to Berlin 4 days ago. There are several things that I want to comment on, or maybe we'll try to respond here. One, I'm very thankful for, again, focusing on the matter of ecocide, and for reminding us how important it is to return to this notion in this particular context, to remind its history and maybe rethink it again in the way how we see how conventional war and the war, like war on people and war on non-people, is in fact one war. But I think if we need to do some work, this one of the dimensions, one of the discussions that has to expand, particularly rethinking at least these two dimensions and how they come together. And this is already, it has to do with solidarity, because that's where precisely solidarity expands the realm of people. And for me, thinking of solidarity always expands the realm of people, because it has to be about environments inhabitable by various species. And as we see how precisely with these environments, the tiny, delicate connections that compose them are being destroyed forever. Um, maybe you can remind me a couple of other,
Resistance
resistance.
without guns.
Yes, with
And for us
without.
to support you.
Exactly. As you probably sensed through the tone of my presentation and through those kind of thoughts and struggles that I myself had through this entire time, my whole work of noticing something, doing all this self-ethnography was because I was so worried a year ago that militarism would spread. It was an unacceptable, super hard idea that I thought was already the worst. And now here I am asking for very different kind of help. And it's strange for me to think that this transformation has happened. But at the same time, very much kind of recently, I've learned to not to be afraid of that transformation, because I think myself, us in Ukraine, and everyone here have to acknowledge that it's not really about weapons and tanks. We missed the moment when things could have maybe gone differently. So that was, of course, about general corruption. And recently I was watching for one interview where one Ukrainian politician quoted the conversation with one European politician who apparently told our Ukrainian politician, speaking about both Ukraine and Russia, that your corruption is our economy. This is the principle that has been like underlined many different processes. And if people in Europe, in economic and political areas wouldn't have thought this way, then, back then, was the moment of doing something different. And now, indeed, we only need to stop this somehow faster. And that's why we need literally military help. And there is no other way, because as I am very much persuaded, the negotiation will not happen. So we are in a non-communicative relation. We are not given the space to communicate. So, and this is extremely upsetting, terrifying, horrible, horrible, but that's where we are now, I think.
I have one very quick point that I was thinking about when you were speaking, and I wanted to just also hear your thoughts on this. Maybe after this we will have a very short time for a couple of questions, I hope. Which is when you're speaking about the new forms of nuclear cyberwar, and I felt that the two terms weren't necessarily separate here, even though you went into them with more detail. But it was about, it feels that we are also, maybe Sloterdijk didn't get it entirely right? I mean, it's not, you know, there's something much more direct about attacking the enemy's environment, which is that it's about designing and making a new environment, an environment which is lethal, or which does not allow you to continue, right? So in that sense, I'm just wondering, right, that what has been sort of the main, what would you say is the place of environmentalism right now in Ukraine today? Right, I mean, in the way environmentalists and ecologists are responding and sort of acting.
There is not much possibility to act. We are very much, and our scientists, environmentalists, ecologists, and etc., very much in the process of assessment the situation. And assessment, of course, is extremely difficult because obviously there is not enough data. there are different ways, so remote ways, for example, to still get certain data, but we know it's very particular kind of data with remote sensing and technologies. And they bring this data in conversation with the experience of previous wars. So in a certain way, from what I talked with different institutions, that is the ultimate thing Ukrainian scholars can do, assess, and maybe create some projections. But the most dangerous and the most infected areas are still close to the front lines. So obviously, even if there is some data somehow accessed, nobody can really talk about this because it's still kind of, they may reveal something through this data. So this conversation kind of almost stuck or delayed, perhaps, right? So even if we have data, we cannot really show and discuss it. Otherwise, we don't. Mostly remote sensing. So, but at the same time, again, right, the complex picture still composing itself with time, maybe very slowly, but we are very much in the mode of comprehension what is happening now.
Thank you. Are there any burning questions, or I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions, if that's possible, from the audience? And is there a roving microphone, or I can give? Oh, there is. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Hi. Yes.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the great lecture and wonderful response. In this zone of non-communication that you're talking about, and the disinformation, and as being used as a weapon, we just now see how China is taking a communicative stance on this. How do you and your colleagues and friends, wherever they are, in and outside Ukraine, counter that mass disinformation that threatens, let's say, even public opinion, which is so important outside of the Ukraine, to support the cause?
Indeed, there is quite overwhelming flow of disinformation coming from all sides. It's very, even before the full-scale invasion, the media sphere were pretty unbearable. And I had several weeks, like if I can speak from my experience, several weeks in the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022, when I, trying to understand, a media scholar, trying to understand the kind of the political landscape and what's happening even within Ukraine, I couldn't watch TV. So like you are constantly reading about like and encountering the intelligence about upcoming war, but there is almost kind of impossible total aversion to any discourse. So, and that of course only intensified massively, right? And what this particular thing that I observed and discussed in the lecture, so that I always almost tend to identify it as a qualitative shift. So that's not just disinformation anymore. This is a terror, production of terror. And it's a big question, like how you live with this. And again, if I can speak from my experience, but writing that diary or a self-ethnographic project was a method of survival at the same time, but also a search for a certain methodology of understanding and maybe even speaking about it, but also kind of, you know, finding my own way, as I was saying at that time, to process informational by a diagonal somehow, structuring the event. So it's interesting. And then I also spoke to different people and heard from friends and others that so many people were engaged in what some diarizing of the war that suddenly I understood that knowingly or unknowingly many people are engaging in the same survival practice. So there is some kind of way of almost kind of mediating by your own writing and structuring, right? So with this very aggressive, terrifying media sphere, especially what comes with this kind of humiliating, terrorizing discourse, which on one hand you think you can laugh at when you hear about drowning Ukrainian children, you think. And then at the same time, even that finds its way to your affective kind of sphere. So you cannot believe some ridiculous thing, but then it finds a way to you. So in a certain way, I feel like what this mediation has been in quite a variety. So people did different things, but even kind of photographing, recording, processing, taking notes, moving from date to date. It's hard to me to name someone who does not do it. In the end, at the beginning, it seemed to me that only I do it. And then after all these months, I know some hundreds people who do that. And that's what pretty amazing, and I think that is one of the resistance forms, and at the same time, witnessing. So it combines very kind of different practices, which are still very much kind of develop, I think, but something will be happening out of that soon, I guess. Yeah.
And I would just quickly add that, you know, that disenfranchisement, that qualitative difference is also a shift to actually incitement to act, right? A kind of, you know, possibly prosecutable offense.
But at the same time, I just add here, many have been noticing that the amount of evidence available now about this war actually posits a problem for even prosecution or collecting it or structuring it or whatnot. So suddenly we speak a lot and hear a lot about the amount of evidence that somehow we don't even know how to theorize, combine, and etc. precisely for this reason. So maybe maybe the first paradoxical situation like this, especially also given, as Nabil mentioned, so many people now are engaged in Ukraine in collecting evidence. So basically, every media blogger, fashion blogger, whoever, they're all collecting evidence now. And if you look especially for, like, say, YouTube channels of people who were only interviewing some, you know, stars or advertising products, they now go to Kharkiv, to Kherson, but because they feel kind of already responsible as this capital, huge following. So, and it's also quite amazing sort of interesting movement to observe today in terms of this evidence collection.
We're very much over time. I think we have maybe time for one more question. You had your hand raised. There was another one there. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I think it would be, thank you so much. I'm only going to go with one topic then. I think it would be incredibly useful, and I have to say, like, for our dear friend Alexei, that because we are sitting in the Canadian Embassy, and because of the horrific treatment of Indigenous First Nations populations across the Americas, from Spanish colonialists to other, like, imperial powers, I think, it would be useful to never not point that out, and for you to expand on how you're defining Indigenous and First Nations populations in terms of Russian imperialism.
Thank you, Diane. Yeah. As you probably know, or if you don't, the huge number of Russian soldiers are drawn from the areas of Siberia, Far East, and Dagestan and other parts of the Russian Federation where population is underdeveloped. But of course, and how I define, these are people who were living in those territories forever and who were colonized basically and even further underdeveloped and, by the Russian Federation. So this is a horrific event because what it is a weaponization of race. And as much as this discourse already problematic, extremely problematic on the entire post-Soviet realm, we are now getting into some complete terrible mess and unresolvable pains and offense and misunderstanding and assumptions and etc., of which I cannot even imagine when we will get out there. So in Ukraine, this topic itself is pretty much a kind of misunderstood. But where we are now, it's horrible. So it upsets me greatly. Not that I remove the responsibility from those who still with enjoyment do rape and murder, etc. But then it's again another very complex, overdetermined event and another huge tragedy that we probably don't realize fully at this very moment. Thanks for that question.
Yes.
As someone who experienced a war in Yugoslavia as a teenager and not as a media researcher, I'm curious, when did you notice that this moment has passed where the things could have went the other way? And was this somehow a moment that a media further reduced to a shorter kind of time frame or an opportunity?
Yeah, it is only from now I can say that there was some moment, maybe, right? So it's still that's how it is with the complex events like that. So we are constantly looking for moments like this in the past. But I did think a lot about potential beginnings, right? So the moment of irreversibility is a complex question, and of course it's moving depending on what is happening now. And at one point I thought maybe that, maybe this. But then when you think about the beginning of the war, I think that is more questions that kind of lends itself better to thinking. And here, I believe that there is no one beginning of the war. There are beginnings, right? So you may hear that the war began on February 24th, but of course in Ukraine, everyone just calls it either the beginning of a full-scale invasion, and it's important to say that it's a full-scale invasion because the invasion actually happened in 2014. And then the beginning of the war maybe was in 2014, but maybe the beginning of the war somehow coincides with like building of the Crimean Bridge, so infrastructural connection, or maybe it was still with Tuzla, or maybe something else, right? So it is, again, it really depends where you now, that suddenly all these multiple beginnings of the war present certain frameworks and lenses to actually understand what multiple dimensions of what is happening now. So there were many, right? And probably we will see even more depending of what will happen, right? So speaking about Chernobyl, or building the atomic energy infrastructure, or thinking about, and more and more and more. So,
Yeah, a very brief question concerning. Yeah, I'm here. A very brief question concerning what you mentioned in terms of Chernobyl. I mean, you vividly depicted the manipulation and the hijacking of the Russians of the very sensitive infrastructure of Ukraine. Not only the human losses, but also that the heavy bombardment of the power system has. There was a lot of damage to the electricity and everything. Do you see a long-term problem that Russia could be able to manipulate through cyber crime and through manipulation the entire infrastructure system of the Ukraine also in future, even though the war would be over? Because after 2014, we have seen in the western part of Ukraine that they have somehow be able to manipulate and to use cybercrime to, paralyze the entire electricity of Ukraine. Thank
you. Yeah, so we have obviously the occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station has a huge impact on the current situation with energy in Ukraine, and the fact that we are in constant deficit, and therefore we have all these long blackouts and no internet and no heat, no water in some places, etc., etc. It's very difficult to make some projection, but we see it is happening now, and it is quite like this realm of blackmail is open and it's happening, right? But something I didn't mention in my talk, and I find quite interesting when you think about the whole atomic energy infrastructure. In one of my conversations with people who worked there, they explained to me that there is a very, the atomic energy infrastructure, given the risk situation, given the specifics of that, it itself is even its own world. So, and the workers who work at those stations, their first allegiance is to the industry. Their second allegiance is to the state. And in a certain way, it creates a very interesting situation that opens other ways of leverage and blackmail and terror, because the Russian forces, by entering the premises of the station as they did, for example, at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, they almost have a back door, right? So it's easy because people know that they cannot respond to the violence, right? So because it's very dangerous. And at the same time, the people who work there, this particular knowledge about operation of the stations that they have, it's not the kind of knowledge that you can even give under the torture. It's a very tacit knowledge that takes kind of, years. I was told 10 years, a decade is needed to educate and produce a kind of very qualified, deeply knowledgeable station operation. And people who are at the station in the same time, they are kind of almost obliged to keep working. And that's also another, right? So they are kind of become hostages in a very different way. Hostages because of they belong to the industry, profession, responsibility, and etc. And therefore, you hear that people at the Chernobyl nuclear power station, which is again not even a nuclear power station by decommissioning site, people there worked 600 hours shift, right? And we don't even know enough what is happening at the Zaporizhzhia station because we don't have information or full information. So, yeah, so things we will learn and things we are already learning about this. Again, it's a terrible, very complex and huge part of what this particular blackmail and non-communication at the same time divide. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we can continue the conversation informally. A huge thanks to Svitlana for this really amazing lecture. Thank you so much.